G'day, mates! Today we're going to talk about evolution and natural selection to get at this question, where does all the biodiversity come from? These millions of species of animals and plants and fungi on the planet, where did they arise from? The answer is evolution. So evolution simply is just the change of living things over time. And that can happen in a variety of ways. This could happen randomly. It could be happening artificially directed. And what I mean by that is directed by humans, whether it's dog breeders selecting for certain traits in breeds over time, or farmers selecting for higher crop yields in their corn or their vegetables or whatever over time. These are examples of artificial selection where deciding which organisms live and mate with one another is done by humans. It's artificially selected. It could also be naturally selected. Nature itself, it doesn't have a conscious mind. It's not making these choices actively, but moments in nature, disruptions, etc., natural disasters can, quote, decide who lives and who dies and who mates with one another and who doesn't. So I like to break natural selection up into 4 pieces. Natural selection is just the process by which evolution happens in a natural ecosystem not directed by humans. I break it up into 4 pieces: competition, variation, differential survival, and heritability. Let's walk through each of those now. So competition is something we've talked about before. There are limited resources in an ecosystem. Think about what resources they're competing for. What are those limited resources? Those limited resources mean that there's a struggle for existence, right? I want what you have. You've got what I want. And so not everybody's going to survive. More offspring are produced than will actually survive. Second of all, the second important piece is that there's variation in a population. Everybody's different. Even from human to human, there are a lot of differences, right? The obvious ones are things like skin color, eye color, height, weight, hair color, right? But there are a lot of things you can't see physically that distinguish one human from another. And variation can arise in the form of mutations, which are genetic differences that happen during the transcription and translation of DNA replication. Don't worry about that. Just know that there are differences among populations. We talked about this with genetic biodiversity. The third piece is that some of these variations, these differences between organisms, are going to make a difference in deciding who lives and who dies, or who has sex and who doesn't, right? Some variations might increase the organism's fitness. And fitness does not refer to how swole you are when you go to the gym, but rather your chances of survival or reproduction given a certain environment, okay? And that's where this term survival of the fittest comes from. So fitness, right, is dependent on your environment. So what determines fitness? Your environment. It's not just necessarily who's the biggest and the strongest, but where they live, right? A great example are these mice called pocket mice. The brown color allows for great camouflage on the brown terrain. But if that brown mouse moves to the lava flow, the dark color, they stick out and they're visible to predators. The opposite is true for the dark mice. The dark mice blend in on the dark background, but they stick out in the light background. Their fitness depends on their environment. And these variations are the variations in this coat color on this pocket mouse is the difference of just one singular mutation and one base pair in the DNA. So these variations can happen pretty frequently within nature, and they can make a big difference in who survives and who reproduces. And ultimately, that's the end of the show, right? Is the big finale moment is having sex and passing your genes off to the next generation. Because it's not just about who survives; it's also about who survives and then passes their DNA down to their offspring. Right? Genetic differences are heritable; they are passed down, sperm and egg. Right? And the differences that increase your fitness, whether it's survival or reproduction, are more likely to get passed down. So these characteristics become more common in a population over time. Here's an example with the pocket mice that I was just showing and predation, and showing how the population can evolve from a mixture of colors to a predominantly darker colors over time. So the big picture, the big takeaway is that incremental genetic changes, small mutations, allow populations, not individuals, populations, to adapt to their specific environment, right? Your fitness depends on where you are over time. This doesn't happen overnight. This happens over many, many generations. So incremental genetic changes allow populations to adapt to their specific environment over time. And that leads, over hundreds of millions of billions of years of Earth's history, right? That leads to the vast biodiversity that we see on Earth, right? Here's some example of Hawaiian honeycreepers on the Hawaiian Islands, and depending on the environment that they live in, they've evolved different adaptations, which have led to all of these different species of Hawaiian honeycreeper that specialize on different types of food sources. This guy's my favorite. He looks pretty cool. Although he's got a cool color going on. I like that. A couple of misconceptions that I often hear when I'm working with my freshmen in biology about evolution. First of all, again, fitness, the misconception I hear is that, oh, the strongest, fastest, biggest organism is the most fit, no matter what. Well, that's not the case, right? A polar bear is super big, super strong, and it's super well fitted for its environment. But if you take it out of that environment and you put it in the desert, it's going to have a bad time. Right? So fitness depends on the environment, not on the individual itself. Second misconception I often hear is that organisms willingly develop new traits. They choose to get new adaptations in order to help them out. First of all, it's not an active choice. Second of all, it's not something that happens over the span of an individual's lifetime. That's what Lamarck thought. He was sort of a contemporary of Charles Darwin who had his own theories about evolution, but he was wrong, right? A giraffe can't will its neck to grow longer, right? Evolution occurs at the, and it doesn't happen within a lifetime. It happens at the level of a population, not at the level of an individual. Sorry, that's a typo. That shouldn't say species. That should say individual. In fact, let's fix it right now. Oh, you get to see behind the curtain. Ooh, that's how the sausage is made, folks. So evolution occurs at the population level, not the individual level, and it takes multiple generations to occur. The third misconception I often hear is that evolution isn't like working towards a perfect, optimal goal for like the ideal human or the ideal cat, or but that's not true. Evolution is an imperfect mechanism. One example is your eye. When you see an image, it gets reflected into the back of your eye upside down, and your brain has to then flip it right side up. This is an example of an imperfect adaptation that has arisen through evolution. Another example is the left recurrent laryngeal nerve, which goes down your neck, and it actually loops around the aorta of your heart, which causes this is a waste of space. Why doesn't it just cut across right here? That may not seem like a big deal, but in a giraffe, that results in an extra loop, this yellow loop here, which ends up being about 14 feet of wasted nervous tissue that could be used, that energy could be used somewhere else. So evolution is not perfect. It is imperfect. And that these mutations are random, right? They arise, and whatever is more fit will survive. It doesn't mean it's the most fit it could possibly be, it just means that it is more fit than the alternative. And the last one, and the most common one, is that humans come from monkeys. Humans didn't come from monkeys. We evolved with monkeys. We share a common ancestor with monkeys. That'd be like saying, oh, I evolved from my cousin. No, you didn't. You and your cousin share a common ancestor, your grandparents, right? But you have not evolved from one another. You have arisen from the same family tree. Okay, so something to keep in mind is that evolutionary changes don't just happen randomly, right? They're often instigated by environmental changes. And these disruptions in the environment could be something that appear out of nowhere. They could be much more gradual. They could be geographic changes. They could be changes in the abundance of resources or sexual preferences of certain mates. They could be natural, caused by nature, or they could be anthropogenic, caused by man or human. These natural disruptions can lead to evolutionary changes and can oftentimes also change the total landscape of an ecosystem. Examples that you are familiar with: forest fires, storms, floods, earthquakes, climate change, asteroids, tsunamis, you name it. These disruptions can destroy habitat. That's not good. They can force species to migrate. They can cause the climate to change on a local level. They can isolate species, and they can cause extinction, and they can lead to instances of evolution and adaptation. One example is these birds. I love this headline. The rare heron blown across the Atlantic that has bird watchers twitching. Wow, I'm not sure I've ever been so excited about something that I start to twitch. But this is an example of a storm, a natural disruption that forced a whole population of birds across the ocean. And if they establish a population over there and were able to actually start sort of incorporating themselves into the ecosystem, evolving and adapting over time to that population. Another great example is Sharknado. I don't know if you've seen this documentary, but it shows how that a natural disruption can actually relocate species from one space to another. Something important to keep in mind is that these disruptions can vary both in how frequently they occur and the scale on which they occur. An asteroid has a much larger impact than, say, a landslide. Right? They could be local, like a landslide. They could be global, like an asteroid, like I just said. They could be very brief, something that happens very quickly, or very prolonged, that happens over a long period of time. Earthquakes are kind of brief, but you could say a hurricane is much more long. They could be gradual, something that builds up over time, like flooding, or it could be sudden, like a volcano eruption. It could be something that happens regularly, like hurricanes, or it could be something that happens randomly, like an asteroid, and it could be periodic or episodic. This kind of goes hand in hand with regular or random. The way they differentiate these terms in the AP curriculum is that periodic happens at regular intervals and episodic happens at more irregular intervals, but both of them are happening like every so often, right? Like hurricanes happen at regular intervals, but maybe earthquakes do not. You can kind of predict when they happen, but not necessarily. Something else to keep in mind when we talk about the scale of disturbances, I want to zoom in or perhaps zoom out a little bit and look at these global scales of natural disturbances. A great example is the sea level and glacial ice. This is a picture of the United States, what it looks like during the Ice Age. And you can see that much of the Northern American continent, all of Canada, and significant chunk of the United States is covered in ice. And I'm not meaning like, oh, it's kind of cold. I mean, it's covered in a giant ice sheet, right? So things were very, very different hundreds of thousands of years ago. And if you look at this graph, right, this is millions of years ago. So as we move to the right on the x-axis, we're going further back in time. And on the y-axis here, we've got the sea level change, right, in relation to the glacial ice. So we can see that over time, the sea level has varied multiple, like this is where we are today at 0, right, that's the baseline. But in the past, sea level was significantly higher. You can see that the sea level was particularly low at the last time where we had lots of glaciers because a lot of that water was trapped up in glaciers. The takeaway from this graph is that the sea level and the ice covering the Earth vary and has changed significantly over geologic time, talking hundreds and millions of years. Right, and here's a graph showing that, again, we're doing thousands of years ago. This time the axis is flipped, so current day is here and back in time is over here. And this change in sea level is on the y-axis, and you can see that they label here, this is the glacial maximum, the last time 21,000 years ago when we had the most amount of ice. And as that ice started to melt, the sea level rise started to increase until we're here today. So as we continue to see ice melting in the polar ice caps, we're going to see more sea level rise. There's an ice sheet in Greenland, looks like this, and this article just came out the other day. It says assessment of past, present, and future ice loss from the Greenland ice sheet shows that rates of loss in the 21st century will be much higher than those at any time in the past 11,000 years. Here's a graph showing modern day at 0 here, 12,000 years ago in the past, and the change in ice mass, gigatons per century. So you can see that the ice mass changes over time. It fluctuates, right? But the predictions, here's where we are today, the predictions by 2100 are outweigh any of those natural fluctuations that we've seen. The current rate of ice loss in the Greenland ice sheet is about 0.7 millimeters per year, and they predict by we get to 2100, depending on the outcome, could anywhere between 2 and 7 millimeters per year. So it could get up to 10 times faster. Another disturbance that we see on geological timescales is carbon dioxide and temperature fluctuations. 0, present day, is all the way here, and then we've got all these different time scales here going back 4 million years, 60 million years, 500 million years, and the data gets foggier and foggier as you go back in time. But you can see that the Celsius, we're looking at temperature changes in Celsius. There is a lot of fluctuation in temperature over time. Things are very hot, and then they start to cool off, and then as we get into the Pleistocene era, they start to fluctuate a lot, and then we have the Ice Age, and things freeze over, and then it starts to get warmer, and then we're in the Holocene, which is kind of where we are now, and then as we enter the Anthropocene, the age of man, we start to see the temperature rise. So, our existence has been like maybe from 10,000 years to present day for modern humans. And take a look at this image. We've got carbon dioxide on the top over time, and we've got temperature on the bottom over time. You can see, again, as we talked about at the start of the year, how tightly correlated these two are, right? As CO2 increases, temperature increases. When there's a spike in one, there's a spike in others. And take a look at this spike of CO2 at modern day. That's pretty high, much higher than anything else we've seen in the past. And if we zoom in on that a little bit, right, you can see that spike even more so. So there's a much faster change. Even though there's lots of fluctuation over geologic history, we're seeing a much faster change today. So, like I said, natural disruptions can lead to environmental change, and these environmental changes alter the habitat. That's going to change the selective pressures on the different organisms living there, which is going to lead them to either adapt, move, or die. Right, so imagine we've got a wildfire that comes through, it leads to some environmental change, it changes the habitat. That's going to put some pressure on organisms. Are you going to adapt? Are you going to evolve? Are you going to migrate, move, and never come back, or are you going to perish? And it's not something that species actively think about, right? It's sort of a fight or flight type thing. And evolution is totally random, keep that in mind. It's not something they're deciding to do, they don't decide to adapt. But these are ultimately the three outcomes when a natural disruption comes through an ecosystem. And something I want to leave you with, and we'll talk about this next class, is that it's not just natural disruptions that can lead to evolution and habitat change, but it can be human disturbances as well. And we'll look at an example with pepper moths next class. So I want to leave you with this question for now. How are species adapting to human disturbances? Keep that in the back of your mind for next class, and I'll see you later.